Today's episode of the Energy Newsbeat podcast is brought to you by Enverus. The energy industry faces massive challenges every day, and the events over the last 2 years have caused huge disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Enverus is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Enverus has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Enverus.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Today is just a fabulous day. I'm here with one of my favorite companies, and we got some real good data to talk about. My name is Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group, and welcome to the Energy Newsbeat podcast. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Enverus, and they are absolutely a wonderful sponsor. I'd like to introduce John Gutentag, and John is a senior analyst over there at one of my favorite companies. John, welcome, and thank you for stopping by.
Thanks for having me, Stu.
Oh boy, that was a long little thing there. So we're just chit-chatting right before this interview, and I'll tell you, it's kind of fun. You've got two really cool reports that we get to talk about here. But as we were talking and getting ready for this, I want to just give you a shout out and a thank you for your time that you spent. You spent 5 years on a rig.
Yeah. I spent 5 years working for a directional drilling company out in West Texas before making the swap to Enverus and making the swap to being a data analyst.
So you went from digging in the mud to being a data analyst. So that's pretty darn cool. Doesn't that help you as you're doing your job because you were boots on the ground out there?
I definitely think it's helped me, especially with just in the ESG field. There's so many different things that we're looking at. So just to have a good understanding of field operations has been really helpful to myself and to our team. Brings good context to what's going on because I've seen the equipment that's emitting the emissions. So it's helpful to have that kind of knowledge.
Oh, that is fantastic. I'll tell you, the rig hands out there just have my admiration and everything else. So I'm glad that you have that experience. In fact, I think all college graduates need to go do that. Just kidding. Just kidding. Okay, we're moving right along here. We're going to talk about two things today, ESG and then also the Inflation Reduction Act. And I keep getting tickled by the Inflation Reduction Act because I don't think it's going to reduce any of the inflation. And I think, quite honestly, it's going to have a different effect. And I loved your report on the Inflation Reduction Act. And there were some really good key points in there. What were some of the ones that you had in your report there?
So I think one of the biggest ones that I think stands out is that this tax it's intensity-based tax, which means that they're looking at the amount of methane emissions you're emitting over the amount of gas you're producing. And what that means is that they're not taxing every metric ton of methane you're emitting. They give you a set amount, and that depends on the sector. And we'll focus on upstream today. So for the upstream sector, you're allowed 0.2% of your gas into sales can be emitted as methane emissions. And what that means is that if you're a low intensity operator where your methane intensity is below 0.2%, you don't pay any tax. And if you're above that, you're only paying tax on the methane that is above that. So for example, if your methane intensity is 1%, that would mean you'd be paying taxes on that 0.8%, and then you get the 0.2% as a gimme. So you'd be paying tax on 80% of your methane emissions. And what that means is only 30% of upstream gas sent to sales in 2020 violates that threshold. So it's really only targeting the high emitting, low producing assets that have high methane intensity.
Okay, I still think that's going to generate a lot of money, and I think it could absolutely increase the price for gas. Even by my crayon math, I'm sitting there thinking that could be a lot of money. So when you take it now, I did like your comment in the report is that it does entice folks to get it under control. I like the way that that was phrased in there.
Yeah, no, that's definitely how we feel. And for the cost of it, we modeled it on 2020 data. So this tax doesn't come
Right.
in until 2024. So we're making assumptions
Oh,
that nothing's going to change until then, which we know is definitely not a true assumption. We know, one,
right.
there's a lot of operators already working actively to reduce these emissions, especially
Oh, cool.
specifically methane. So we know that's already happening. And then there's also some work on the ground at the EPA to kind of change how some of these reported numbers are being calculated. So we will see a little bit of shimmy there as well. But what we calculated off 2020 numbers would be that at the 2024 rate of $900 per metric ton, for
Right.
the upstream and midstream sectors, that would be about $1.2 billion a year across all of the country. And then at the 2026 rate, that would be $2 billion a year. And those sound like big numbers, but when you normalize them to production, you're talking nationwide, the average is 10 cents per barrel or 10 cents per BOE, so barrel of oil
Right.
equivalent. And then that average will jump up to 26 cents per BOE if we're only looking at that 30% of production that triggers the tax. So they are
Okay.
big numbers, high level, but when you normalize them to production and look at it like a unit cost,
Right.
it definitely brings it down to more manageable levels. So if you're an oil producer, 10 cents a barrel. If you're a gas producer, that's like 2 cents a MCFE. So
Right.
starting to be 850 gas, 2 cents are going towards this. Not the biggest deal, but definitely
Right.
not negligible.
Well, I'll tell you, that makes me feel a little better because, quite honestly, when I was getting my crayon out and doing some math, I got into that $1 billion range there, and I'm kind of like going, that $1 billion is going to hit the consumer. And so I like that explanation better on that. So now there's some other taxes in there and other fees that are in the Inflation Reduction Act. Or is that the biggie?
That's the big one, targeting
Okay.
emissions for oil and gas. And what we see it as is this is like the first explicit tax on emissions. So we've heard about
Right.
ESG being like ESG risk. This is the first time that I've seen it where it's like a tangible monetary risk to companies that are high emitting methane or high methane emitters. And there's
Right.
definitely options. We don't actually see this as any kind of form of long-term revenue generation or anything like that. What we see it as is the federal government regulating via taxation. So what since it's intensity based, you get below the methane intensity of the threshold and you no longer pay the tax. And then also within the law is if you're compliant with their new regulations when they come out, you're no longer going to have to pay the tax either. So really what it is, it's a quicker way to get these oil companies to reduce their methane emissions. And there's easy
Okay.
ways to do it that pay off quickly. And I can go through one if you want with some specific numbers.
Oh no, I really like your thought process, but uh, I think that once a tax is put in place and they see the revenue, I just think the government always goes in and says, "Oh, this month it's 11 cents per be anyway," and then all of a sudden it's now 50 cents the next year. So, I just am a cynic when it comes to taxation.
Yeah, no,
So
I can feel that. I don't like paying taxes either.
no, especially when they have a bazillion new IRS agents. And now, why do you think the private operators are more exposed than the public?
So everything we did was all data driven. So we took 2020 emission numbers that are reported to the
Okay.
EPA and ran the calculations for every single field for every operator, and then
Right.
summed it all up. And what we saw there was that when I mentioned that 30% of the gas is subject to it, the 78% is not subject to it. When we break those up by private and public operators, the numbers turn into 50% of gas coming from private operators is above that threshold, and only 20% is coming from public producers. So that
Wow.
means that like that was where we got that comment that privates are more subject to it, and it's just because they happen to be the
Right.
owners of the high emitting, low producing assets. So some of your legacy gas
Wow.
plays and things like that.
And that makes sense, and that also goes back to why I really like Enverus. I'm not kind of bragging on Enverus here for a sec, but I'll tell you what, if you got to make decisions in the energy space, there's only one Enverus, I'll tell you that. So that's a good answer as well. What do you think the operator liability is? Because I think there's a really liability feature that is going to get worse as we go along.
Yeah, so I actually feel a little bit differently about it. I actually think the liability is going to get better as we go along because it's written into the law, the methane intensity threshold that you have to stay below. And what we've seen is methane emissions are going down. So the more those continue to go down, the more operators, the more production that's going to fall under that threshold. And so I think as time goes on and more operators focus on reducing methane emissions, we're actually going to see that liability come down. There's definitely going to be some liability still there. If and if operators make no changes, that liability is going to stay there. And that's why we think it makes more sense to spend the money now to reduce your emissions and get the equipment you need, rather than paying this tax into perpetuity. Like, because it's an annual fee, you pay it every year. Versus if you get under that threshold, you pay nothing every year. So if you spend the money one time to fix your emissions, you now never have to pay the tax as long as you stay below that threshold.
So boy, the CO2 companies that are actually monitoring all these things are going to be the darling at the ball there, because you're going to need those. I don't believe that there's ESG without accountability, and it seems like you're going to need accountability to quit paying taxes.
Yeah. No, definitely. We've definitely seen a large increase in operators seeking out like continuous monitoring solutions or responsibly sourced gas certifications and things like that. And we definitely see that. We see it almost more as environmental credibility rather than like chasing some premium for selling greener gas. Like what we see it as is like, we're certified, all of our production is monitored, and like you can confidently buy our gas knowing we're not emitting large amounts of methane. And like I definitely I like that pathway, and just showing that like this is what we're doing, and we're just going to stay producing gas. We're going to keep providing the nation with energy, but we're going to do it as sustainably as possible in the short and long term.
Well, that makes sense. What's the definition difference of just producing it nicely or having it produced as responsibly? I mean, people want to say it's responsibly produced natural gas. Is it the same thing, or is there something different there?
So physically, the molecule is not going to be any different. It's still going to be like 96% methane. It's going to be pipeline quality gas, but the difference comes in with how it's being produced at the wellhead and along the value chain. So like I guess the biggest question is really around methane. Like that's what most of the questions we hear about RSG and responsibly sourced gas. People want to know the methane intensity of this gas. So the same thing that the IRA tax is looking at, methane intensity, that's what people want to see. Now there is a ton of things that like people like Project Canary or MIQ or Equitable Origin look at, and there's like it's all encompassing on the ESG front. So it's not just emissions and environmental, but we think that like the biggest piece is definitely that methane piece. That's where most of the concern is around natural gas. So naturally, that's where they spend a lot of money in figuring out how to accurately monitor and quantify methane emissions. Because right now, everything's done by emission factors. There's not very much direct measurement going on, especially for EPA reporting. So definitely excited to see how that unfolds.
Well, as you're an analyst in your oil and gas experience, are you working with anything on the methane from renewable natural gas or any of that, or is that it's in your bailiwick? So like taking responsibly renewable natural gas from dumps and those kind of things.
Yep. Yep. So I've done a little bit of work on that for sure. So
Okay,
that's
cool.
it's a little bit different though. So responsibly sourced gas, that's going to be like your conventional fossil fuels. They're coming from wells, and it's just coming from
Right,
wells where they're like there's a third party verification of the ESG component, or like the emissions and like the water sustainability and things like that. And then
right,
renewable natural gas is actually going to be separate, and that's going to be that gas coming from landfills or coming from cow manure, and they're turning it into usable gas. And
right,
there's some pretty hefty credits on some of those renewable natural gas projects if
right,
they're targeting the right end user. And then there's like a whole voluntary market developing too with natural gas utilities. They're having
right,
these net zero commitments that they're making, but their entire
right,
business is taking gas from one point and delivering it to people's homes. So it's kind of hard to reduce your scope 3 emissions if that's your whole business. And the best thing they
right,
found is hydrogen and renewable natural gas, because the carbon impact of renewable natural gas from farms is actually negative. You're helping prevent methane emissions from these farms, and you're taking
right,
methane emissions and turning it into energy that people can use. And
right.
they definitely have some pretty crazy project economics on some of those ones if you can get it to the right end user and qualify for
Right.
those credits.
Well, that's kind of cool,
Yeah.
actually. But Project Canary is a good group of people out there. And when you sit there and take a look, those sensors and real-time monitors that are out there, that really does help add accountability to the entire ESG line. Um, taxation without having accountability would be like rut-row. They would just show up and start taxing everybody heavily. Um, anyway, that's all negative. But you also have your ESG report. Do you want to go through a little bit about, because we've talked about the ESG in all of the upstream as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. Is there anything that we missed on the ESG in that report?
And not so much on the IRA and like the methane report. That's very
Right,
focused on just the methane component of ESG and it's the
right,
financial impact of that. Um, as for like overall ESG, yeah, I'd be happy to go through like our view of that and how we look
yep,
at scoring and things like that, because we know
that would be
ESG.
helpful.
Yeah, for sure. So we know ESG scores are really like a dime a dozen. There's so many people out there putting these out, and like we feel like it's really hard to have some kind of one quantitative number that you can compare all these different industries against. It's really
And
hard. Like to us, it's a very subjective practice. Like
right,
you pick what's important to you, and then you have to figure out how you rank it. Like my boss likes to say, it's internalizing historically externalized data points. So um, you're
say that
taking
again. That was
uh,
actually really good. Say
yeah,
that
it's
again.
the ESG is about internalizing historically externalized data points, with emissions being the attribute that most investors and industry participants are agreeing on right now. Everyone thinks
Right,
that's the issue. And so what we try to do is build out a scoring matrix, and we build that out by using a blend of our experience and our analyst
yeah,
expertise. And then also we've had hundreds of conversations with both industry participants, so on the institutional investor side, and then also on the operator corporate side. So we get to hear it
right,
from both sides, and we get to hear what investors are caring about and then what operators are focusing on. And then what we do with that is we just create this very transparent framework that our
right,
clients can then use, where we focus on 35 metrics, and then we very clearly show how they rank on those and how we score
right.
those and how we sum it up to like a one total value.
Oh, that's I'm really pleased by this because I think ESG has made a positive impact in the oil and gas space over this. But I think that there's not a fair definition because everybody's like, just like you said, there's 17 different definitions for just about everything. And then when you have people out there going, I got ESG, and some people can't even spell it. And so it makes it really tough. Um, do you think there's going to be a universal ESG where everybody, how do you think that that's going to come around?
Oh, that's a tough question for sure. Universal ESG. I
Uh,
think it's hard to do. Like I think it's hard. We hear about these scoring agencies. They say 3,000 metrics to come up with their score. I can't even list 3,000 data points to collect like accurately and across the board. I feel like the way we look at it is we want to focus on the few topics that we've heard in conversation and focus on oil and gas. We have energy expertise. We know
right,
the ESG and the normal oil and gas landscape. Like we have expertise in that area. So what we try to do is focus just on the things that matter, and then we
right,
iterate on that. So this one we just put out was our third time doing this, and we
right.
get feedback after we put it out, and we try to implement that to better, I guess, give a better example of what the industry is seeing and what they're saying about ESG. And then we
Well,
also
I,
try to provide our clients with the framework we came up with, and we give them all
yeah,
the underlying data, and they can change the weighting. If they're like, oh no, I don't think any of these are important, they can set all those to 0, and then you can do the same benchmarking work, see the relative benchmarking, but
right,
only focus on what matters to you. And like a large or small operator is going to care about something other than a big bank or a PE firm or
right.
something like that. Like it's all different, and there's no one size fits all in my opinion.
No, there really isn't, and that's why I threw you that curveball, John. And I absolutely loved your response because I just threw that out there to see how you'd respond, and I am very pleased with your answer on that. It was like you didn't curl up in the fetal position and like try to run away or anything. That was a really good answer. What do you think is the next step for Enverus in the ESG space?
So we have a couple of things working on. So there's kind of 2 buckets, or I guess 3 buckets that you can look at for ESG. You can look at
Yep.
what operators are voluntarily reporting. So that's just aggregating sustainability report and proxy statement data and things like that, which we already have
Right.
that down packed. We already have a system in place for that. Then there's also working with the reported data. So the information that's being reported to the EPA or the equivalents in Canada is what we're focusing on right now, and we have that data down to a really granular level, and we can do some pretty deep analysis on that. Hence the
Right.
IRA report and things like that. We can quickly quantify some of these new taxes or new regulations and see what the impact's going to be. And then
Right.
we're working on enhancing that with some additional analytics. So we're working on making that better, doing what we do best at Enverus. And then the last piece that's a little bit newer is focusing on directly measured data. And we work in the public space. So the direct measured data that's going to be in the public space is really going to be satellites. So we're pretty stoked to see methane sat launch pretty soon. Because right
Right.
now, if you're looking from space, the best granularity you can get is like, I think it's like 5 by 5 kilometers, but
Right.
methane sat is going to bring that down to, I think it's about like 2 football fields. So you're going from like huge
Wow.
field level measurements down to like almost pad level measurements. And we think that's going to bring some visibility into what we like to call the known unknown, which are the methane emissions that aren't reported. So it's maybe a pop-off
Nice.
valve that blew and it's just been leaking gas for a few weeks. No one knew. They just close
Right.
it back up, and then nothing happened. Nothing gets reported. But if you're
Right.
seeing it from space, it's a little bit harder to hide. And there's definitely challenges with
Yeah.
that, but that's something we're pretty stoked about, and we've been working hard to understand how to work with that geospatial data.
Well, that really, John, you just nailed a really big discussion point there. Not only is it going to be used for oil and gas upstream, I mean, this thing could be really used across almost all manufacturing or anything else. So, I mean, that Enverus, if you got to make a decision in energy, you got to use Enverus. But this means that you guys could probably open up some new markets.
Yeah, no, we've definitely been going headfirst into energy transition and things like that. So moving, I don't want to say away from energy, but still within energy, but trying to be all encompassing
Right.
and look at every piece of it. So yeah,
That's some pretty cool stuff. So
yeah.
what's next on the corner for John? What do
What's
you
next
got
on the
working
corner for
around?
me?
Yeah.
Uh, I right now I'm going to school to get a master's degree in predictive analytics. So I'm hoping to be a data scientist, hoping to get to work with this data, build models, things like that. That's what I enjoy doing. And
Okay.
then I've also been enjoying writing these market research reports too. So definitely
So
want to keep
how'd you get to working on a rig? Because you went from rig to Enverus, and now you're working on getting your master's in data analytics. How did you get from the rig to Enverus?
Yep. So I graduated with a petroleum engineering degree in 2016, which is
Yep.
probably arguably the worst year to graduate with that degree in the last like 2 decades. I got I got really lucky, and I got my job for the for Premier Directional Drilling, their small directional drilling company, and
Right.
I got lucky getting that job. I started at like $9 an hour, and then worked there for like 4 or 5 years, and then actually got laid off temporarily during COVID when all the rigs went away. Went
Right.
back, but while I got laid off, I started going to school. So I started working on my master's, and then went back to the rig. I was working on the rig and working on my master's, and it was really hard. And then
Right.
I got lucky, got this job with Enverus, and they've been really helping me build out my skill set while I get to keep going to school. And then they're really adamant
Wow.
about getting me into the right position for my skills. So it's been a really positive experience.
I'll tell you what, that is just outstandingly cool. So, I'm going to have to keep tabs on you and see as you go through the ranks there and everything else. But I'll tell you, John, I absolutely appreciate your time and also your industry expert. I think you did absolutely outstanding here. And so I'd love to have you back sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to be back. I appreciate the exposure and inviting us on, and I love talking about this stuff. So I'm happy to do it whenever.
I'll tell you, it's fun when I love talking about energy and everything else as well too. And so it's really fun when you're, talking energy and having a great time. But I just like to also thank our sponsor, Enverus, and all of the great things that they're doing. So thank you all very much. And thanks for stopping by the podcast.